After Jenny Clark found out that she had been kidnapped as a toddler from an orphanage and that her parents had illegally adopted her from traffickers, she was heartbroken to realize her entire life had been nothing but a lie. But despite them not being her real parents, they were the ones who had cared for and loved her all these years. She still loved them and hoped they could somehow rebuild their connection, even if it would take time. However, Jenny was not ready for what else she would uncover: the full truth about how she got her scar, why her parents hadn't tried to adopt her legally, and the devastating reality that the lie she had been living would turn out to be even worse than she thought. Before we dive into part 2 of this shocking story, comment where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Since that night at the police station, Jenny Clark's life had been irrevocably transformed, thrust into a whirlwind of legal battles and emotional upheaval as she navigated her new reality with her sister, Samantha. In the early weeks following the family court proceedings, she had stood before the judge, her parents, and her sister, voicing with quiet conviction her desire to embrace her real name, Jenny Clark. Though Anne, the social worker who had overseen her case from the start, had gently advised her to take her time, warning that her emotions might be influencing her decision, Jenny felt an undeniable pull toward reclaiming her true identity. The court had also advised her to hold off on speaking to her adoptive parents, James and Catherine Fisher, until she had fully processed her emotions, a distance that felt both like a protective barrier and an open wound. Meanwhile, she had moved in with Samantha, who, despite being only 18 and just beginning her first job, welcomed her without hesitation. The judge approved the arrangement under Anne's careful watch, and she visited them multiple times a week, not only ensuring the stability of their living situation, but also observing Jenny's emotional journey, her slow but undeniable transformation. Day by day, with every interaction, the name Jenny Clark settled deeper into her being, eclipsing the identity of Jessica Fisher, the name she had carried for as long as she could remember. And with each passing moment, the fragile thread of sisterhood between Jenny and Samantha strengthened, weaving together a bond that time, distance, and circumstance had nearly erased, but was now being rewritten, one shared moment at a time. Today was near the end of the first month since the incident. Jenny and Samantha had received notification from Anne yesterday that she's coming today. It was in the Saturday afternoon at midday, and Samantha had just arrived home from her early morning shift. They had arranged that specific time so they can all sit together and talk. They were at the living room of Samantha's apartment, and Anne handed them another letter invitation from her adoptive parents. This has been the 5th letter so far. Jenny opened the letter, and it was handwritten like the other 4 letters before, where they asked to see her and have a conversation with her with Anne and authorities together overlooking it. Jenny held the letter in her hand, the weight in her hands far heavier than the paper itself. She froze, staring at the letter, and Samantha touched her arm in supportive gesture. James and Catherine said they wanted to tell her everything, to finally reveal the truth and answer any questions she had. A lump formed in her throat, and she gripped the edges of the letter as if steadying herself against the emotions threatening to pull her under. Anne, who had been watching closely, spoke gently. "Jenny, you don't have to do this. Not yet. Not ever, if you don't want to." But after a while, Jenny says, "I think I want to," she finally said. "I think I'm ready now." Jenny traced the edge of the paper, her mind a tangled web of memories. Her mother tucking her into bed, her father teaching her the school homework, the way they encouraged her through the therapy, never once complaining about the medical bills. She inhaled deeply, then exhaled, her voice quiet but certain. "This week, I've been thinking with a clearer head, and if I'm being honest, I miss them," she admitted, the words feeling foreign yet undeniably true. "They're the ones who cared for me for years. They made sure I got an education, paid for my burn treatments. They loved me, even if—" She hesitated. Even if they had lied. Even if they had hidden the truth from her for so long. Samantha's grip on her arm tightened briefly before letting go, a silent show of faith in Jenny's choice. Jenny looked up, meeting Anne's careful gaze, and Anne nodded. "You're right," Anne said, her voice steady. Being adoptive parents doesn't make them any less than biological ones. I know how much they cared for you, even if the way they adopted you and kept it all a secret was wrong." Then she added, "If you're truly ready, we'll begin sorting things out. We'll put everything back in order." She turned towards Samantha, searching for something, reassurance, understanding, maybe even permission. But Samantha didn't hesitate. She reached out, giving Jenny's hand a firm squeeze. "I'll support whatever decision you make," she said, her voice unwavering. "No matter what happens, you'll always be my sister. I'm not going anywhere." Jenny touched the burn mark on her face, glanced at the letter once again before she confirmed with Anne that she wants to meet her parents now. Anne asked her if she really wants to do it now, because they can arrange it tomorrow, but Jenny shook her head and said, "Now is a good time." The stood-up formed the sofa at the living room. Samantha and Jenny grabbed their stuff and followed Anne out of the apartment unit. They exited the apartment building, got into Anne's car, and they drove to the station. The sun hung high in the sky as Anne's car pulled into the parking lot of the police station. The imposing brick building loomed before them, its windows reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. Jenny felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach as she stepped out of the car, the weight of what she was about to do settling heavily on her shoulders. Samantha reached out and squeezed her hand, offering a reassuring smile. "You've got this, Jenny," she said softly. "I'm right here with you." Anne led the way into the station, her heels echoing against the polished floor. Inside, the cool, sterile air was a sharp contrast to the sweltering heat outside. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a stark glow over the bustling space. Officers moved with purpose. Phones rang constantly, and an unspoken tension filled the air, thick with urgency and restrained energy. As they approached the front desk, Anne spoke quietly to the officer on duty. After a brief exchange, they were escorted down a long corridor. Jenny's heart raced with each step, her palms growing clammy. She found herself grateful for Samantha's steady presence beside her. They were led to a room with a center table. Anne, Jenny, and Samantha took their seats, the plastic chairs creaking slightly under their weight. Jenny busied her mind, rehearsing her speech and questions in her head, listing them in her mind which one she would ask them first. The minutes ticked by slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. After a few moments, the door opened. 2 police officers entered, followed by James and Catherine. Jenny's breath caught in her throat at the sight of them. They were wearing prison uniforms, their hands bound by handcuffs. The couple looked thinner, more haggard than Jenny remembered. Dark circles shadowed their eyes, and worry lines etched deeply into their faces. Anne spoke quietly to the officers, requesting that the handcuffs be removed. After a brief consultation, the officers complied, the metallic click of the cuffs opening echoing in the silent room. James and Catherine took their seats across the desk, their eyes never leaving Jenny's face. "Thank you, Jessica, for finally agreeing to meet," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. Jenny swallowed hard, steeling herself. "My name is Jenny now," she said firmly. "I'd like you to address me as such. I'm no longer the child." James and Catherine nodded, exchanging a pained glance. When James spoke, Jenny could hear the foreign way her new name sounded on his lips. "Of course, Jenny. We understand." Catherine leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "We know you must have a lot of questions, Jenny. Please ask us anything. We're here to tell you the whole truth." Jenny took a deep breath, her mind racing through all the questions she had rehearsed. Finally, she settled on one. "Tell me again about how you got me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to hear it all from the beginning." James and Catherine shared another look before James began to speak. "We've told this story multiple times now, to you at the camper and in court, but if you want to hear it again, we understand." Jenny nodded firmly. "I do. I want to listen to it again now while I'm clear-headed." Catherine took a shaky breath before beginning. "It all started when I was diagnosed with infertility due to endometriosis. We couldn't have our own child, and it broke our hearts. We tried to adopt through the normal adoption process, but we were rejected because of James's criminal record." James picked up the narrative, his voice low and filled with regret. "We were young back then, and I had big ambitions. Your mother and I, we used to work as con artists. We deceived and stole from wealthy people. It was our source of income." He paused, running a hand over his face. "We were caught by the police several times, enough to create a substantial criminal record. When we finally decided to settle down, get proper jobs and start a family, well, our past caught up with us. Our record prevented us from adopting through legal channels." Catherine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were desperate for a child, so we started looking for unofficial ways to adopt. During our search, we came into contact with an illegal adoption ring and child traffickers. One night there was an accident. The house where these criminals were operating burned down. In the chaos, they left without you, saying you were damaged anyway because of your burns." James leaned forward, his eyes intense. "We were there that night, Jenny. We heard your cries coming from the burning building. Before the firemen arrived, I went in and rescued you. Then we escaped with you before the authorities showed up." To emphasize his point, James pulled up his shirt, revealing a network of small and now barely visible burn scars across his back and sides. "This is from that night," he said softly, "when I pulled you out of the fire." Jenny stared at the scars, her mind reeling. She had never known about these marks on James's body. It added a layer of complexity to the story she thought she knew. "This is the truth, Jenny," Catherine said, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "We've told you everything now. We're not hiding anything anymore." Jenny sat back in her chair, trying to process everything she had just heard. The room fell into a heavy silence as she gathered her thoughts. Finally, she looked up, meeting James and Catherine's anxious gazes. "You saved me," she said slowly, "but you never thought of reporting me to the police. Of trying to find my real family." James shook his head, shame evident in his expression. "We were afraid," he admitted. "We knew that with our records the police would just take you away from us. We couldn't bear the thought of losing you." Jenny felt a surge of emotions. Gratitude for being saved, anger at being kept from her true identity, confusion about how to feel towards these people who had both rescued and deceived her. "I'm touched by how you saved me," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and I owe you my life for that. But it's hard to reconcile that after all these years you're still con artists. You conned me by never telling me the truth. Instead, you lied to me my entire life." Catherine reached out as if to touch Jenny's hand, but stopped short. "It was all to protect you, sweetheart. We only wanted what was best for you." Jenny felt a flash of frustration. Just stop saying that it's all for my sake or to protect me," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Be honest with yourselves. You did it all for yourselves." James flinched at her words, but after a moment he nodded slowly. "You're right, Jenny," he said, his voice low and filled with regret. "We have been lying to you and to ourselves. The fact is, we did this for ourselves. We took you because we wanted a child so desperately. We didn't tell you the truth about how you were adopted because I was too proud. I always wanted to be seen as your biological father. Somehow I believed it would make you love me more, that I was better and had won against the system. You were my declaration that I, a former conman and criminal, could adopt a child." Catherine nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "But we never loved you any less, Jenny," she added softly. "You were our daughter in every way that mattered." Jenny sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing their words. She could feel Samantha's supportive presence beside her, and Anne's watchful gaze. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you for finally speaking the truth. I appreciate your honesty." With that, Jenny turned to Anne and Samantha. "I'm ready to go now," she said quietly. As they stood to leave, James and Catherine's faces fell. "So what now, Jenny?" James asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Are we going to see you again?" Catherine stood up, moving as if to approach Jenny, but Anne quickly intervened, stepping between them. "Please," Anne said firmly but gently, "give Jenny some space. She's still processing everything." Jenny paused at the door, looking back at James and Catherine. Their faces were etched with hope and fear, love and regret. For a moment, she felt a pang of sympathy for them. Despite everything, they had raised her, loved her, cared for her. But the weight of their lies was still too heavy. Without another word, Jenny walked out of the room, Samantha and Anne close behind. As the door closed, she could hear the muffled sound of Catherine's sobs and the clink of handcuffs as the officers restrained James and Catherine once more. In the corridor, once they found a quiet corner, Jenny leaned against the wall, her legs suddenly feeling weak. She bent over, taking deep breaths, trying to process the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. Samantha was there in an instant, her arm around Jenny's shoulders, grounding her with her presence. "Jenny?" Samantha's voice was filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Jenny shook her head, unable to form words. She slid down the wall, sitting on the cold floor of the police station. Samantha crouched beside her, while Anne stood nearby, her face a mask of professional concern. "Take your time, Jenny," she said softly. "There's no rush. Just breathe, we're here with you." Samantha added softly, rubbing circles on her back. Jenny closed her eyes, focusing on her breathing, in and out. Slowly, the tightness in her chest began to ease. When she opened her eyes again, she found both Samantha and Anne watching her with worried expressions. "I'm sorry," Jenny said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's all so much." Anne knelt down beside her, her voice gentle. "You have nothing to apologize for, Jenny. What you're feeling is completely normal. You've just been through an incredibly emotional experience." Jenny nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I thought I was ready," she said. "I thought I could handle it. But seeing them there, hearing everything again, it broke my heart because I had seen how much they really loved me. James admitted all those bad things he did, and I could see how much it hurt him to do so." Samantha and Anne exchanged surprised glances. They had expected Jenny to be upset about her parents' actions, not empathetic towards them. "Oh, Jenny," Samantha said softly, pulling her into a hug. "Your capacity for empathy is incredible. But remember, it's okay to feel angry too. What they did was wrong, even if it came from a place of love." Jenny buried her face in Samantha's shoulder, allowing herself to be held. "I've been trying so hard to hate them," she confessed, her voice muffled. "I just want to hate them, but I can't. How could you love a child abductor? Am I too broken?" "No, Jenny," Anne said firmly. "You're not broken. Your feelings are valid and normal. Loving your parents is natural because they did love you, even though it was built on lies. But they've owned their mistakes now and are facing the consequences." Jenny pulled back from Samantha's embrace, wiping her eyes. She looked at Anne, a question forming on her lips. How long are they sentenced for again?" Anne's expression turned serious. "They've been sentenced to 10 years for both of them," she explained. 5 years for child abduction, as they had taken you, a minor, without consent or proper legal adoption. The other 5 years are for fraud and falsification of legal records, as they had forged documents to pass you off as their biological child. Jenny nodded slowly, processing this information. Then hesitantly she asked, Is there anything I could do to reduce their sentence?" Anne's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She swallowed, clearly thinking carefully about her response. "Well," she said slowly, "there are options. We could make a petition or clemency request to the judge, supporting parole eligibility to reduce the 10-year sentence for James and Catherine Fisher. You could start by writing a forgiveness letter for the judge." Anne paused, her gaze intense as she looked at Jenny. "But Jenny, I need to ask, are you sure about this? There's no turning back if we take this route. The judge and the court take this kind of petition very seriously." Jenny nodded, her expression resolute despite the tear tracks on her cheeks. "I understand," she said. I need to go home and think about this, but I want to consider it." Anne nodded. "Okay," she said. "I'll only call the legal representative once you've confirmed you're ready. For now, let's get you home. You need rest after today." They all stood up, brushing off their clothes. They walked out of the police station into the cool evening air. As they got into the car, Jenny felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. The drive back to Samantha's apartment was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Anne bid them goodbye, reminding Jenny to take her time and think carefully about her decision. As the social worker's car disappeared down the street, Jenny and Samantha made their way into the apartment. Once inside, Jenny turned to her sister. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I think I need to be alone for a while. Is it okay if I go to my room?" Samantha nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, Jenny, take all the time you need. I'll be here if you want to talk." Jenny retreated to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She sat on her bed, surrounded by the few possessions she had brought from her old life. For a long moment, she just sat there, letting the events of the day wash over her. Then, almost without realizing it, she found herself reaching for her laptop. She opened it, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before she began to type. She dove into research, looking up legal terms and conditions for clemency and probation. Finally, as the clock ticked towards midnight, Jenny felt ready. She opened a new document and began to write her forgiveness letter. Draft after draft, she poured her heart onto the page, trying to find the right words to express the complex tangle of emotions she felt towards James and Catherine. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her window, her eyes grew heavy, the exhaustion of the emotional day finally catching up with her. Jenny slipped the letter into an envelope and placed it on her writing desk. The following weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings and emotional turmoil. Anne connected Jenny with a child legal representative, and her days became filled with meetings, discussions, and long conversations with Samantha, who remained her unwavering support. At last they received a court date. On the morning of the hearing, Jenny's nerves contrasted sharply with the bright, clear sky. Meeting Anne outside the courthouse, they climbed the imposing steps together, the weight of what lay ahead pressing on Jenny's shoulders. Inside, the courtroom felt heavy with unspoken tension. When James and Catherine were led in, their eyes met Jenny's, flickers of hope and regret passing between them. The proceedings unfolded, with lawyers presenting arguments and the judge listening intently. When it was Jenny's turn to speak, she stood and read from a letter she had written weeks before. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger as she spoke about love, forgiveness, and the complexity of human choices. She acknowledged the pain of betrayal, but also the care she had received, urging the court to consider an alternative to the full 10-year sentence. A heavy silence followed her words. Then the judge rendered his verdict. James and Catherine would serve 5 years of probation, undergoing counseling and community service, with any violation leading to imprisonment. Relief washed over Jenny as she saw tears in her parents' eyes, not just for their reduced sentence, but for the second chance they had been given. That evening, as they exited the courthouse, the setting sun cast long shadows over the steps. James and Catherine were escorted away, returning to prison for their final night before beginning probation. Anne encouraged Jenny and Samantha to go home and rest, promising they would discuss the next steps later. As Anne's car pulled away from the courthouse parking lot, Jenny leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the city lights blur past. The car wound through the evening traffic, carrying her not toward the home of her childhood, built on lies and secrets, but toward the new home she was creating with Samantha, one founded on truth and genuine familial love. The next morning, Jenny woke to the gentle sound of Samantha calling her name and the feeling of her sister's hand on her shoulder. Groggily, Jenny opened her eyes, squinting against the sunlight streaming through the window. As consciousness fully returned, so did the memories of the previous day's events, settling over her like a heavy blanket. "Jenny," Samantha said, her voice tinged with urgency, "you need to come downstairs. There's an officer here, and Anne." Suddenly alert, Jenny sat up, her heart racing. "What? Why? Did something happen?" Samantha's face was etched with worry. "I'm not sure. It's better if you come down and hear it for yourself." Jenny quickly changed out of her pajamas, her mind whirling with possibilities. Had James and Catherine violated their probation already? Had there been some mistake with the sentencing? As she followed Samantha down the stairs, she tried to brace herself for whatever news awaited her. In the living room, Jenny found Anne and a police officer she didn't recognize. Their grave expressions did nothing to ease her growing anxiety. "Jenny," Anne began, her voice gentle but serious, "this is Officer Ronnie Mitchell. He has some news about your mother, Catherine." Jenny's heart sank. "What happened? Is she okay?" Officer Mitchell cleared his throat before speaking. "Miss Clark, I'm afraid there's been an incident. Your mother was taken to the hospital this morning after she fainted and suffered a seizure while we were driving them home." Jenny felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. After everything that had happened, after all the progress they had made, this felt like a cruel twist of fate. "Where's father?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is he with her?" "He's at the hospital with another officer," Mitchell replied. "We thought it best to come and inform you directly." Anne stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Jenny's shoulder. "Try not to panic, Jenny. It's better if we go to the hospital and learn from the doctor what happened. We can leave right away if you're ready." Jenny nodded numbly, her mind struggling to process this new development. She glanced at Samantha, drawing strength from her sister's steady presence. "Okay," she said, taking a deep breath. "Let's go." The drive to the hospital seemed to take an eternity, even though Jenny knew it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. The city passed by in a blur outside the car windows, but Jenny barely noticed, her thoughts consumed with worry for Catherine. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Jenny felt a surge of déjà vu. How many times had she been here as a child for her burn treatments? The familiar sight of the hospital's facade brought back a flood of memories. Catherine holding her hand as they walked through these same doors, James cracking jokes to distract her from her fear of needles. The conflicting emotions these memories stirred up only added to Jenny's anxiety. Inside, they were directed to Catherine's room by a harried-looking nurse. As they approached, Jenny could hear raised voices. She recognized James's voice, sounding distressed and angry. Entering the room, Jenny took in the scene before her. Catherine lay unconscious in the hospital bed, looking small and vulnerable amidst the tangle of IV lines and monitoring equipment. James stood near the bed, his face red with anger, as he argued with a doctor and another police officer. "This is ridiculous," James was saying, his voice strained. "My wife has never used drugs in her life." The doctor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes, was trying to calm James down. "Mr. Fisher, please, we're not making accusations. We're simply reporting what we found in her blood work." Jenny stepped further into the room, drawing everyone's attention. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice small but steady. The doctor turned to her, his expression softening. "You must be Jenny," he said gently. "I'm Dr. Patel. I'm afraid we've found traces of an illegal substance in your mother's bloodstream. We're still running tests to determine exactly what it is and how it got there." James's face crumpled at these words. "This is wrong," he insisted, looking pleadingly at Jenny. "You know your mother, Jenny. She would never do something like this." The police officer, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Mr. Fisher, I'm afraid this could jeopardize your probation. If we find evidence of drug use, you may both be facing additional charges and a return to prison." Jenny felt as if the room was spinning. This couldn't be happening. Not after everything they'd been through, not after the judge had shown mercy. "But there were lab tests before the hearing," she said, her voice shaking. "There weren't any traces of drugs then. How could this happen so quickly?" The officer shrugged, his expression sympathetic but firm. "It's possible she abstained for 24 hours before the court date to pass the test. We've seen it before." James looked devastated. "How long until she wakes up?" he asked Dr. Patel, his voice barely above a whisper. "It shouldn't be too much longer," the doctor replied. "We've been flushing her system. She should regain consciousness soon." The officer nodded, his face set in a grim expression. "We'll wait until she's awake to question her. In the meantime, I suggest you all prepare yourselves. This situation could have serious consequences." As the doctor and officer left the room, Jenny felt overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. She turned to Anne and Samantha, seeking their support. Anne's face was a mask of professional concern, while Samantha looked as shocked and confused as Jenny felt. Can I sit with her?" Jenny asked hesitantly, gesturing towards Catherine's still form. The remaining nurse nodded, and Jenny approached the bed slowly. She took in Catherine's pale face, the dark circles under her eyes, the slight frown that creased her brow even in unconsciousness. Despite everything that had happened, Jenny felt a surge of protective love for this woman who had raised her, who had loved her as her own. Taking a seat beside the bed, Jenny gently took Catherine's hand in hers. It felt cool and limp, so different from the warm, comforting touch she remembered from her childhood. As she sat there, holding Catherine's hand and watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, Jenny's mind raced. She couldn't believe that Catherine would have turned to drugs. It seemed so out of character for the woman who had always emphasized healthy living and warned Jenny about the dangers of substance abuse. Could the stress of prison and the legal battles have pushed her to this point, or was there more to this story than met the eye? As these thoughts swirled in Jenny's mind, she noticed a slight movement. Catherine's fingers twitched in her grasp, and her eyelids began to flutter. Jenny's heart leapt, a mixture of relief and apprehension flooding through her. "She's waking up," Jenny called out, her voice trembling slightly. James hurried to the bedside, his face a mixture of worry and hope. Noticing the change in the monitors, the nurse quickly moved to inform the officers and Anne outside. Catherine's eyes opened slowly, confusion evident in her gaze as she took in her surroundings. What happened?" she mumbled, her voice hoarse and weak. Dr. Patel stepped forward, his manner calm and professional. "Mrs. Fisher, you're in the hospital. You had a seizure and lost consciousness while we were driving you home from the prison. How are you feeling now?" Catherine blinked, struggling to focus. I'm not sure, everything feels fuzzy." The police officer moved closer, his expression serious. "Mrs. Fisher, I need to ask you some questions. The doctor found traces of an illegal substance in your blood work. Can you explain this?" Catherine's eyes widened in shock. "What? No, that's impossible. I've never taken drugs in my life." James nodded vigorously. "That's what I've been trying to tell them, Catherine. This must be some kind of mistake." The officer's face remained impassive. "Mrs. Fisher, I need to remind you that any drug use would be a violation of your probation. If you have any information about how this substance entered your system, now would be the time to share it." Catherine shook her head, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "I don't understand. The last thing I remember clearly is being released from prison yesterday morning. We were driven home and then everything gets hazy after that." Jenny, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "Is it possible someone could have given her something without her knowing?" The officer considered this. "It's a possibility we'll have to investigate. Mrs. Fisher, did anyone offer you food or drink after your release?" Catherine's brow furrowed as she tried to remember. I think my cellmate, Martha, gave me a drink at breakfast before we left. But surely she wouldn't." The officer made a note in his pad. "We'll look into that. In the meantime, I'm afraid we'll need to investigate this further. If we find no evidence of deliberate drug possession or use, you may be able to continue your probation. But if we do find anything suspicious, you'll both be facing a return to prison." Jenny felt her heart sink at these words. After everything they had been through, after the judge had shown mercy, it seemed cruel that this new obstacle had arisen. The officer turned to James. "Mr. Fisher, we'll need to question you as well. Please come with me." As James was led out of the room, Jenny found herself alone with Catherine. The older woman turned to her, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jenny, I didn't take any drugs," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "I would never do anything to jeopardize our chance to make things right with you." Jenny felt torn. Part of her wanted to believe Catherine unconditionally, but another part, the part that had been lied to for so many years, hesitated. "I want to believe you," she said softly. "But after everything that's happened, it's hard for me to trust completely." Catherine nodded, pain evident in her eyes. I understand. I know we've given you every reason to doubt us, but please, Jenny. Before Cather could finish, James returned to the room, his face pale and drawn. They're going to investigate Martha and search our house, he said. They've given us some time to ourselves for now. Jenny stood up, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the intensity of the situation. I need some air, she said, her voice shaky. I'll be right outside. As she stepped into the corridor, Jenny leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm herself. She saw the police officer talking on his phone a short distance away, catching snippets of conversation about inmate, possession, and search. Samantha appeared at her side, her presence comforting. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. Jenny shook her head, feeling lost. "I don't know what to think, Sam. Part of me wants to believe them, but another part, I just don't know if I can trust them completely." Samantha wrapped an arm around her sister's shoulders. "It's okay to feel conflicted, Jenny. This is a complicated situation. Whatever happens, I'm here for you." Jenny watched the officer finish his call and approach them. "The investigation at the prison continues. Your parents can go home for now. We'll contact you if we need more information." Jenny nodded, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. As the officer walked away, she turned to Samantha. "What do we do now?" Samantha gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "One step at a time. We'll get them home, then figure out the next move." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. The medical team prepared Catherine for discharge, completing her IV treatment and providing instructions for follow-up care. Jenny watched as James hovered anxiously around Catherine, his face etched with worry and barely contained frustration at their circumstances. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Officer Mitchell approached them once more. "I'll be escorting you home," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. "Another officer will meet us there to go over the terms of your continued probation." The group made their way to the parking lot, the tension palpable as they split into two groups. James and Catherine followed Officer Mitchell to his patrol car, while Jenny and Samantha got into Anne's car. The drive to James and Catherine's house was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. Jenny watched the familiar streets pass by, memories of her childhood flooding back with each turn. It felt surreal to be returning to the house she had grown up in under these circumstances. As they pulled up to the house, Jenny saw another police car already parked outside. A different officer stood on the front porch, clipboard in hand. The gravity of the situation hit Jenny anew as she realized the extent of the investigation based on the single incident. They all gathered in the living room, the space feeling smaller and more oppressive than Jenny remembered. The new officer, who introduced himself as Officer Thompson, explained the rules and restrictions. "We'll be conducting regular check-ins and random inspections at your house," he was saying to James and Catherine. "Your probation officer will be visiting next week to check on you. Any violation of the restrictions I mentioned will result in an immediate return to prison." Jenny watched as James and Catherine nodded solemnly, the weight of their situation evident in the slump of their shoulders and the worry lines creasing their faces. Anne, who had been a quiet but steady presence throughout the ordeal, turned to Jenny. "Do you still want me to accompany you?" she asked gently. Jenny considered for a moment before shaking her head. "It's okay, Anne. I think we can handle it from here. Samantha will be with me." Anne nodded, understanding in her eyes. "All right, but remember, I'm just a phone call away if you need anything." As the officers and social worker prepared to leave, Jenny felt a sudden urge to stay, to try and make sense of everything that had happened. She turned to James and Catherine, who looked lost and vulnerable in their own home. "I think I'll stay for a while," Jenny said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "If that's okay with you." James and Catherine exchanged a glance, hope flickering in their eyes. "Of course, Jenny," Catherine said softly. "You're always welcome here. You too, Samantha." James said, turning to her. Jenny quickly found her mind wandering. She looked around the living room, taking in the familiar furnishings, the family photos on the walls. It all looked the same. And yet everything had changed. Catherine offered a faint smile, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "All right then. "Dear, I want to go to my room to rest." James nodded, and as they headed toward the hallway, Jenny caught a glimpse of Catherine's face. Her eyes were weary, and though her lips curved slightly, there was no joy in her expression, nothing like the relief of returning home after a long time away. Jenny noticed the sadness in Catherine's gaze, and it stirred something deep in her. Weren't they relieved to be home? Hadn't they begged her to visit and reconnect? After everything, weren't they eager to rebuild their family? Before they disappeared into the hallway, an idea suddenly crossed Jenny's mind, one she hadn't fully thought through before speaking. "Mother, Father," she called after them. They paused and turned back, and she hesitated for a brief moment before adding, "What do you think about having dinner together tonight?" James cleared his throat, glancing at Catherine. Jenny couldn't help but notice their strange, almost reluctant reaction. "Maybe not today, Jenny," he said quietly. "Let's wait until Catherine's fully recovered. We'll do it then, all right?" It was the kind of hesitation and rejection she hadn't expected. These were the same people who had sent her heartfelt letters, begging to see her, pleading for the opportunity to make things right. They should have been eager, willing, even desperate to jump into the idea of reconnecting over dinner. With that, they disappeared into their room, the door clicking shut behind them. Jenny stood frozen in place, a mix of confusion and disappointment settling in her chest. Why had they reacted like that? Was something different now that they were home? She'd expected warmth, maybe even an eagerness to show her that they were ready to rebuild, but instead there was distance. She couldn't help but wonder if they still loved her, or if she was just a tool to get them out of their mess, a convenient pawn in their desperate game to avoid prison. The idea made her stomach turn. Samantha, who had been standing quietly beside her, seemed to sense Jenny's restlessness. "Maybe they just need time," she said softly, her voice steady. "This whole thing must have been overwhelming for them too. It's the first time they're home after months in prison. Let them take it slow for a few days." Jenny wanted to believe her, trusted her even, but the doubt still gnawed at her. Samantha and Anne were the only people she truly felt she could rely on now. Sensing Jenny's need for a distraction, Samantha quickly changed the subject. "While we're here, why don't you show me your old room? We'll head home afterward." The suggestion brought a spark of light back into Jenny's eyes. She hadn't thought about her old room in months, but the idea of revisiting it, of reconnecting with a part of her past, felt like it might bring her some peace. "Sure," Jenny said, "I'd like that." They made their way upstairs, the creaky wooden steps echoing in the quiet house. Jenny opened the door to her old room, and the familiar smell of dust and stale air hit her immediately, wrapping around her like a forgotten memory. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. It was just as she had left it before she had been taken away in the camper, unchanged, untouched. Her heart ached a little at the sight. "This was where I was sitting when I decided to text you," Jenny explained to Samantha, gesturing to the bed where she had sat all those months ago, holding her phone with trembling hands. She remembered how her parents had found the newspaper article in her bag, the one about the missing girl. The memory stung, and Jenny quickly shoved it away, not wanting to dwell on it now. She was trying to start fresh, to build something new, something better. As they chatted, the weight of the moment hung heavy between them, until a sudden noise from the hallway interrupted their conversation. A loud, muffled argument echoed from downstairs, followed by silence. Jenny's brow furrowed, and she exchanged a glance with Samantha. They moved toward the door, trying to make sense of the sounds. Standing at the top of the stairs, they both strained to hear. There was no one in the kitchen or living room, but the noise had definitely come from her parents' bedroom. It sounded like a short, heated argument before it quieted again. Jenny's heart began to race. What were they arguing about? Suddenly the door to the bedroom downstairs opened, and Catherine's voice floated up, her words barely audible but clear enough to hear. "Camper," she said, the word hanging in the air with an odd finality. Jenny's mind scrambled, trying to make sense of it. What was her mother talking about? The camper. Then she heard her father's heavy footsteps as he moved toward the stairs. "I'll go," James muttered, his voice distant and flat. The words sent a chill down Jenny's spine. What did this mean? Where was her father going? Was he planning to go back to the camper? to the place where everything had fallen apart. She felt a wave of confusion wash over her, and as she turned to Samantha, the unease between them was palpable. Neither of them could understand what was happening, or why her parents were acting so strangely now that they were home. Jenny's thoughts were abruptly interrupted when James called her name from downstairs. She rushed to the edge of the staircase, her pulse quickening as she leaned over the railing to see him standing in the hallway below. "What is it?" she asked, her voice a little too eager. "I'm going to get some groceries," James replied, his tone casual but not quite meeting her eyes. "I'm going to cook dinner for all of us tonight." A knot of confusion tightened in her stomach. The grocery store? Her father wasn't a man who often cooked meals, and something about the way he had said it, his reluctance to meet her gaze, made her doubt his words. Still, she smiled and said, "I'll come with you. Keep you company." James quickly shook his head, his voice firm. "No, you should stay here with Catherine. We can't leave her alone at home." His tone, though gentle, had a finality to it, a subtle command that Jenny wasn't used to. He turned away from her, pacing toward the front door, his steps hurried, almost anxious. Jenny and Samantha exchanged a glance as James stepped out of the house. They heard the creaking of the car's engine from the garage, a sound that seemed unusually loud and strained. Jenny felt a ripple of discomfort in her chest. His car had been sitting idle for months, and the sound of the engine struggling to start felt like a metaphor for everything that had been so off in the past few days. Jenny leaned against the window, staring out into the dimming evening. "Samantha, what do you think is going on here?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. Samantha shrugged, her expression thoughtful. "I'm not sure. Maybe he really does need to get groceries. Maybe things are just a bit off with him, considering everything that's happened." Jenny shook her head, still troubled. "But I heard them talking about the camper. Why would they talk about that? They might just have been talking about it, and we only heard part of the conversation. Maybe it's a misunderstanding. But then again, it's almost sunset. Who would visit the camper at this hour?" The thought lingered in Jenny's mind, and for a brief moment she was transported back to that day, the day her parents had taken her to the camper instead of to her best friend's house. She could still feel the sharp, uncomfortable tension in the air, the way they had tried to hide the truth from her. She turned to Samantha, her voice dark with the weight of the memory. "They did." The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the walls were closing in on them. Jenny stared out the window, her heart pounding. Something wasn't right, and the feeling gnawed at her with every passing second. "I want to follow him," Jenny said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her mind raced, her thoughts scattered. "We still hear his car warming up in the garage. We should call Anne. Right now we don't even have a car. Maybe she could help." Samantha looked taken aback, her eyes widening in surprise. "You want to follow him?" she repeated, her voice a little shaky. "Jenny, that's not a good idea. We shouldn't be spying on him." But Jenny wasn't listening, her jaw set with determination. "They lied to me for years, Samantha," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You heard what they admitted themselves, how they were con artists. They've been lying to me for years. Even if it turns out he's really just going to the grocery store, I need to see it for myself. I need to know I can trust them again." Samantha's eyes softened, her reluctance evident. She seemed to struggle with the decision, the tension in the air palpable. After a moment, she let out a deep sigh, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," she said quietly, finally relenting. "I'll call Anne, but we need to be careful, Jenny. If they find out, it'll make things worse." Jenny nodded, her resolve unwavering. "Thank you." Samantha immediately pulled out her phone and dialed Anne's number, her fingers quick and precise as she spoke to her, explaining the situation and asking if she could come over. Jenny stood still, her heart pounding as she waited, her mind racing with possibilities. When the call ended, Samantha looked at Jenny, a mix of concern and reassurance on her face. "Anne's on her way," she said. "She'll be here soon." Jenny exhaled, feeling the weight of the situation settle in her chest. "Thanks for believing me," she murmured. Just then, the sound of James's car engine rumbled through the air again, louder this time, as it pulled out of the garage and merged onto the road. Jenny's gaze snapped to the window. She saw his car leaving the driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness, and a sense of unease flooded her. "He's gone," she whispered to herself, watching the car disappear into the distance. Minutes later, the sound of another car engine echoed through the quiet house, and Jenny's heart skipped a beat. She rushed to the window and saw Anne's car pulling up in the driveway. Without hesitation, Jenny and Samantha hurried downstairs, eager to explain what was happening. Jenny paused in front of the bedroom door. She knocked gently, planning to let Catherine know she was leaving, but when there was no response, she tried the door. She peeked inside and saw Catherine sleeping soundly, her breathing steady and calm. Jenny's chest tightened at the sight. She hated leaving her mother behind in the dark, but this felt urgent. She closed the door softly and hurried toward the front of the house. The door creaked open, and Anne was already standing there, waiting. Without a word, Jenny stepped outside, and the two of them walked briskly to Anne's car, Samantha following closely behind. Once they were settled inside, Anne turned to Jenny. "All right, what's going on?" she asked, her voice a mixture of concern and curiosity. Jenny hesitated for a moment before speaking. "We need to go to the camper," she said, her voice steady, despite the rising tension in her gut. "It's not too far from here. About a 40-minute drive. I heard my parents talking about it before he left. He said he was going grocery shopping, but I don't know. Something's been off all day. Catherine and James, especially James, have been acting really strange. I need to find out what's going on. I need to know if I can trust them again." Anne listened carefully, her expression softening as Jenny spoke. She then asked, "Are you sure about this?" Jenny nodded firmly. "Yes, I don't know why they're acting this way, but I need to know the truth. I can't just ignore it anymore." Anne didn't argue. She understood the urgency in Jenny's voice. "All right, do you remember the way to the camper?" Jenny nodded again. "I remember." Anne didn't waste any more time. She started the car and drove off, the hum of the engine cutting through the night as they headed toward the camper. As they passed the local supermarket, Jenny's eyes scanned the parking lot, hoping to see her father's car. But there was no sign of it. The supermarket was empty, quiet. Nothing like the place her father often visited for last-minute items. Jenny's unease deepened, but she kept quiet, knowing they had to keep moving forward. 40 minutes later, they arrived at the camper site. The sun had fully set, casting a cold, dark shadow over the forested area. Jenny couldn't shake the chill that crept down her spine as she looked out over the camper parking lot. The memories of that day when her parents had taken her here against her will flooded back, uninvited and haunting. She stepped out of the car, her feet dragging as she looked across the lot. Her father's car was parked in the distance just as she feared. Jenny's stomach twisted. Anne looked over at her, then back toward the camper, her expression serious. "I'm calling the police," Anne said, her voice steady but concerned. "Your father's on probation. He shouldn't be here, especially not at this hour." Without waiting for a response, Anne stepped aside and discreetly made the call, covering her mouth as she spoke in a hushed tone. Jenny watched anxiously, her pulse quickening. When Anne returned, she said firmly, "We should wait here." But Jenny shook her head, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please," she begged, "let me just see him. I need to know what he's doing, what he's hiding." Anne exhaled sharply, clearly torn. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded. "Okay, but we're staying far from the camper. We'll only observe from a distance." Jenny nodded in agreement, feeling a sense of relief, though the weight of what was to come still hung over her like a storm cloud. She led the way through the small, narrow path toward the camper, the shadows of trees and thick greenery surrounding them. As they approached, the camper slowly came into view, the familiar yellow police tape still visible around it. A knot tightened in Jenny's stomach. From where they were standing, hidden by the thick bushes, they could see James inside the camper. It looked like he was moving around, searching for something. Jenny's breath caught as she watched him, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. He was feeling the walls of the camper, pressing his hands against them as if searching for something hidden, something important. Jenny's heart raced. She couldn't tear her eyes away from him as he crouched down, his movements deliberate. Then he stood up and moved around to the other side of the camper, disappearing for a moment from their view. When he returned, Jenny watched in growing horror as he knocked on a specific spot on the wall. He removed a piece of wood and seemed to pull something out from inside the hidden creases. Jenny's mind reeled. What was he doing? What had he been hiding in there all this time? Anne's voice broke the silence. "We need to hide," she whispered urgently. "He's walking out soon. Get down. Stay quiet." Jenny and Samantha immediately crouched low behind the cover of the thick greenery, doing their best to stay out of sight. Their breaths were shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests as they waited for James to make his move. James walked past them, completely unaware of their presence, his steps brisk and purposeful as he made his way back to his car. Jenny held her breath, crouching lower behind the dense brush, her pulse hammering in her ears. She watched as he unlocked the driver's side door, glancing around briefly before gripping the handle. Then a sudden commotion erupted from the parking lot. Though there were no sirens, Jenny knew instantly the police had arrived. Anne had requested a silent approach, knowing from past experience that if James or Catherine caught wind of law enforcement, they would bolt into the woods without hesitation. Jenny exchanged a tense look with Samantha before the three of them carefully stepped out from their hiding spot. The trees thinned as they made their way back to the lot, where a group of officers had already surrounded James. The harsh glow of their flashlights flickered across his face, illuminating the moment he realized he was trapped. Jenny saw his expression shift, first confusion, then something sharper, more betrayed. His gaze found hers as she emerged from the shadows behind him. His voice was raw with disbelief. "Jenny," he said, his brows furrowing, "you called the police on me? Again?" She flinched but stood her ground. "Anne made the call," she clarified, her voice unsteady. "But I heard you. You both were talking about the camper. You lied to me. You said you were going to get groceries." James opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, one of the officers stepped forward and began searching him. His movements were methodical, precise. Jenny's breath hitched as the officer reached into James's pocket and pulled out several small, plastic-wrapped packets. For a moment, everything stilled. The night felt heavier, the air thick with something suffocating. James closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. "Please," he said, his voice strained. "I can explain." But Jenny had already begun shaking her head, her vision blurring with tears. "You're a liar," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How am I supposed to trust you? How are we supposed to fix this if you and Catherine keep lying to me?" James' eyes flashed with desperation. "Listen," he pleaded. "This isn't for me. It was for Catherine. I swear to you, Jenny, I didn't know she was using—" Jenny recoiled as if struck. She didn't know who to believe anymore. The weight of all the lies, all the secrets pressed down on her like a crushing tide. One of the officers tightened the cuffs around James's wrists. He didn't resist as they guided him toward the waiting police car. A radio crackled to life. "Requesting backup at the James residence," an officer said into his shoulder mic. "Need a unit to check on the wife and bring her in for questioning." Jenny barely registered the words before another set of flashing lights caught her attention. A separate police unit had already moved toward the camper. Across the lot, Mr. Thompson, the owner of the campground, stood near his office, his expression bewildered as he watched the scene unfold. He rubbed his hands together, shaking his head, just now realizing something serious was happening on his property. One of the officers turned to Jenny, Samantha, and Anne. "We need you all to come down to the station," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's too dark out here and we need to get statements." Jenny barely nodded, her mind spinning. Anne led them to her car, the weight of the night settling over them like a thick fog. As they pulled away from the lot, Jenny sat in silence, staring out the window. The world outside was a blur of dark trees and distant headlights, but all she could see was the broken trust, the years of deception, the gnawing realization that there was still more she didn't know. Samantha reached over and squeezed her hand. Jenny didn't pull away. She just kept staring into the night, wondering how many more lies were waiting for her in the dark. The police station was cold under the artificial lights, the air thick with the hum of quiet conversations and ringing phones. Jenny barely registered the officers moving around them as they were ushered inside. A tall man with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes stepped forward, extending a firm but not unkind hand. "Detective Martin," he introduced himself, "your father and Catherine are being questioned in separate rooms. We'll need to speak with each of you individually as well." Jenny swallowed hard, nodding. She cast a glance at Anne and Samantha before following the detective down a long hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last. She was led into a small, sterile-looking room with a metal table and 2 chairs. The detective gestured for her to sit. "Let's go over everything you saw and heard tonight," he said, his voice level. Jenny exhaled shakily before she began, recounting every detail. The moment she saw her father's car in the lot, the conversation she overheard about the camper, the lies he told her about just getting groceries. She spared nothing, laying bare the entire truth. The detective listened intently, nodding as he took notes. When she finished, he folded his hands on the table. "Jenny," he said, "based on the evidence we found at the camper tonight, it appears your mother has been using for longer than anyone realized, possibly even before she went to prison." Jenny's breath caught. "What?" "We conducted an inspection of her old prison cell earlier today," the detective continued. "We found a packet of substance hidden behind the toilet compartment. One of her former cellmates, a woman named Martha, confessed that she had been supplying your mother with it inside." Jenny felt like the room was tilting. "And this Martha, she was using too?" "Yes," the detective confirmed, "and this morning she laced your mother's drink with it. She told us she didn't believe Catherine deserved the probation." Jenny's hands clenched into fists. Why would she think that? The detective sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You must understand, Jenny, crimes involving children, especially child abduction, are viewed with intense hatred, even among inmates. Those convicted of such crimes often face harsh treatment from their fellow prisoners." Jenny looked away, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. She didn't know whether to feel anger, sorrow, or something else entirely. "They've been lying to me," she murmured, more to herself than to the detective, "building their lives on nothing but lies." The detective regarded her carefully. "That's why we need to understand everything. You said you never suspected your mother was using before." Jenny shook her head. "Never. She never acted strange, not once." "That's possible," the detective admitted. "She might have been using moderately before, but in prison, with the stress and access to stronger doses, it's likely she became more dependent." Jenny's mind reeled, pieces clicking into place. She thought back to 2 months ago, to the way her mother had panicked over the newspaper article, the way her hands had shaken. If her mother had remained calmer back then, Jenny wouldn't have felt the urge to investigate. It was Catherine's own nervousness and unease that set everything in motion. "If she was using in prison," Jenny said slowly, "that means when her drug test came back clean before her trial, she must have stopped on purpose, just long enough to pass." The detective nodded grimly. "At least 24 hours, yes, enough to appear clean for the court." Jenny exhaled shakily, realization crashing over her. She played the system. There was silence for a long moment before the detective spoke again. "With the evidence we have now," he said, "there's a high risk the court will revoke their probation and send them back to prison." Jenny's throat tightened. "You need to prepare yourself," he continued gently. "But if you believe they still deserve probation, you can make a case for it to the judge. The court may keep them on probation but add stricter conditions. Rehabilitation, more years under supervision. Your testimony will carry weight." Jenny's chest ached with the weight of it all. She stared at the table, her mind torn between anger and the love that still stubbornly lingered despite everything. "They failed me," she whispered, "on the very first day." The detective didn't argue, he simply let the words settle. "Think about it carefully," he said. "Whatever you decide, the court will listen." Jenny exited the room and stood in the hallway. She brushed her face and steadied herself before she looked around. Samantha and Anne were still inside one of the interview rooms. While she was waiting for them, suddenly her gaze was locked to a group of officers. Catherine and James were being led down the hallway, their wrists bound in handcuffs. Catherine's face was streaked with tears, her entire body trembling as she turned to Jenny. "I'm so sorry, Jenny," she choked out, her voice raw with desperation. "I hope I can be a better mother for you. I promise. I'll stop. I'll go to rehab. I'll do anything to deserve your forgiveness and trust. Please believe me." James, walking beside her, looked just as remorseful. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his own shame. He turned to Jenny, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm sorry too, for all the lies and secrets." There was an earnestness in his eyes, a plea for her to understand, but Jenny couldn't bring herself to answer. The officers urged them forward, their apologies fading as they were taken out of sight. Jenny stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. It was happening again. She had exposed her parents' lies and, in doing so, had torn apart the fragile sense of normalcy she had fought so hard to believe in. The trust she had carefully rebuilt with them was now in ruins, crumbling in a single night. She barely noticed when Anne and Samantha emerged from their own interviews, their expressions heavy with understanding. Samantha placed a gentle hand on Jenny's shoulder. "You don't need to feel guilty," she said softly. "This isn't your fault." Anne nodded in agreement, her eyes full of quiet concern. "The officers must have told you this isn't the end. You have time to think about what happens next. Your parents are safe behind bars for now, but if you want to continue with the probation, you can petition the judge again." Jenny swallowed hard, her gaze still fixed on the empty hallway where her parents had disappeared. Then she turned to the two women who had become her strongest pillars of support. "I know what they did is unforgivable," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion, "but I also know they love me. They may have built my life on lies, but I think at least some part of it was built on love too." She knew all of this must have been hard for Catherine to process. The uncertainty of whether her daughter, whom she had raised for over 10 years, would ever want to contact her again, and the unforgivable mistakes they had made. That's why she must have fallen back into substance addiction. In some ways, it made Catherine's actions more human, more understandable, not excusable but at least comprehensible, through the lens of someone desperate and afraid. Anne and Samantha listened in silence, letting her find her own words. Jenny exhaled shakily. "I want to stay in contact with them. Maybe we can try, slowly, to build something from the ground up again. I want to make sure my mum gets the rehab she needs. I was nothing but an orphan once, but they took care of me for years, made sure I got the best treatment for the burn scars on my face." She paused, pressing a hand over her heart. "I think it's not too early for me to start caring for them too." The station felt quieter now, the echoes of footsteps fading into the background. Jenny let out a slow breath, watching her parents disappear behind the heavy steel doors. A storm of emotions churned inside her. She had spent so long trying to rebuild trust, only to have it collapse under the weight of their lies. And yet, as much as she wanted to be angry, to cut herself off from them completely, she couldn't. Because love, true love, wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about a flawless past or an easy road forward. It was about persistence. It was about seeing the broken parts in someone and still believing they could heal. Jenny ran a hand over the faint burn scar on her cheek, a stubborn reminder of the past that never fully faded. It was a part of her, just like her parents' mistakes were a part of them. But scars weren't just marks of pain, they were proof of survival. She had spent years believing that she was the only one who carried the burden of their past, but now she understood. Her parents carried their own scars too. Maybe not the ones she could see, but ones etched deep in their hearts, shaping them into the people they had become. Maybe it was time she started caring for them too, not as the perfect parents she had once wished for, but as the flawed, wounded people they truly were. In the end, love was about choosing to stay even when it hurt. And as Jenny stepped out into the night, she realized she was choosing to stay.